How did humans end up in Alaska? Here's the strange part. For most of the last ice age, Alaska wasn't the edge of the world. It was the middle of it. Somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago, a group of people were living on a landmass that doesn't exist anymore, surrounded by a landscape that doesn't exist anymore. And they may have stayed there for thousands of years before anyone ever set foot in what we now call the Americas. This is a story about a place that vanished, and the people who waited there in the dark. Let's go. Start with the map, because the map is the whole problem. Today, Alaska and Siberia are separated by the Bering Strait, about 82 kilometers of cold ocean water. But 20,000 years ago, during the height of the last glacial maximum, so much of the planet's water was locked up in ice sheets that global sea levels sat roughly 120 meters lower than they do now. At that depth, the seafloor between Siberia and Alaska wasn't underwater at all. It was dry land, not a narrow crossing. Not a bridge in the sense of something thin you tiptoe across. A landmass roughly 1,600 kilometers wide, north to south, connecting Asia and North America into a single continuous stretch of ground. Scientists call it Beringia, and it wasn't a passage. It was a place people lived. This distinction matters enormously, and it's the part most casual retellings get wrong. We tend to imagine a land bridge as something you cross quickly, like a hallway between two rooms. Beringia was not a hallway. It was a country. It had its own climate, its own plant communities, its own animals, and, for a very long time, its own human population who weren't trying to get anywhere. They were home. To understand who these people were, we have to go back further, to Siberia, tens of thousands of years before anyone crossed into Beringia at all. Modern humans had been living across northern Asia for a long time, adapting to conditions that are, frankly, difficult to overstate. Temperatures that could fall to negative 40 or 50 degrees Celsius. Months of near-total darkness in winter. Landscapes with no wood in places, forcing people to build shelters out of mammoth bone and hide. These were not people stumbling into hardship. These were specialists. Generation after generation had refined tools, clothing, and survival strategies specifically for extreme cold. And by the time some of them turned east toward Beringia, they were arguably among the most cold-adapted humans who had ever lived. Genetic evidence gives us something remarkable here, a population that geneticists now refer to as the ancient Beringians. Studies of ancient DNA, including a child's remains from a site in Alaska called Upward Sun River, dated to around 11,500 years ago, show a population that split off from other Asian populations sometime between 25,000 and 20,000 years ago, and then appears to have remained relatively isolated for thousands of years afterward. That isolation is the key detail. It suggests a population that moved into Beringia and then essentially stopped. Not because they were stuck, but because Beringia itself was sustaining them. This idea has a name in the research, the Beringian Standstill hypothesis. The proposal is that a founding population entered Beringia sometime before the peak of the last ice age, then remained there, genetically and geographically isolated from both Asia behind them and the Americas ahead of them, for a period that some estimates put at several thousand years, possibly as long as 10,000. If that's accurate, then the ancestors of the first Americans didn't simply pass through Alaska. They lived there, generation after generation, in a place that would later disappear entirely. So what was Beringia actually like? For a long time, the assumption was that it must have resembled the Arctic tundra we associate with the region today, barren, wind-scoured, nearly lifeless. But pollen records, sediment cores, and fossil evidence have complicated that picture. Parts of Beringia, particularly in sheltered lowland areas, appear to have supported shrub tundra with patches of willow and birch, enough vegetation to sustain large grazing animals. And Beringia had large animals in abundance: woolly mammoths, steppe bison, horses, musk oxen. This wasn't a wasteland people were forced to endure. In the right pockets, it may have been a genuinely viable place to build a life, rich in the exact resources cold-adapted hunters needed most: meat, fat, bone, and hide. Life here required precision most of us can barely imagine today. Clothing had to be sewn tightly enough to be functionally windproof using bone needles and sinew thread, because a poorly made seam in that climate isn't an inconvenience, it's a death sentence. Shelters had to trap heat efficiently with limited fuel. Food had to be preserved through months where nothing grew. Every one of these skills had to be taught, practiced, and passed down with near total accuracy. Because in an environment like this, there was no room for a generation to forget how something was done. Now the crossing itself deserves a correction because it wasn't really a single crossing at all. People didn't walk from Siberia to Alaska the way you'd walk from one town to the next. Beringia was where they already were. The real, more difficult movement came later, when people needed to move south, out of Beringia, and into the rest of North America, and that turns out to be the harder puzzle. For years, the dominant theory was the ice-free corridor, a narrow gap that supposedly opened between two massive ice sheets covering what is now Canada, allowing people to walk south between walls of ice. But more recent research has cast serious doubt on whether that corridor was biologically viable early enough to matter. Studies of lake sediments and ancient plant and animal DNA in the corridor region suggest that even after the ice sheets began separating, the corridor may not have supported enough plant and animal life to sustain traveling human groups until roughly 12,600 years ago, which appears too late to explain some of the earliest confirmed human sites further south. That gap in the evidence pushed researchers toward a different route entirely: the coast. The Pacific coastal migration theory proposes that people moved south along the Pacific shoreline of Beringia and North America, using boats, following a coastline rich in fish, shellfish, seals, and kelp forest ecosystems, rather than trying to survive an interior ice corridor at all. This theory is difficult to test directly because the coastlines these people would have followed are now underwater, submerged by the same sea level rise that eventually erased Beringia itself. But indirect evidence supports it. Sites like Monte Verde in southern Chile, reliably dated to around 14th to 1500 years ago, sit so far south so early that a slow interior walk through an unviable ice corridor struggles to explain how people could have arrived there in time. A coastal route, faster and biologically richer, fits the timeline far better. What this means is that the population who eventually became the first Americans were not just cold-adapted tundra specialists. Some of them, at least, were also becoming skilled maritime people, comfortable enough on and around water to move along an unfamiliar coastline, generation by generation, harvesting the sea as they went. The same pattern we see in other great human migrations. Adapt completely to one environment, then adapt again to the next. Eventually, the world changed underneath them. As the Ice Age ended and global temperatures rose, the ice sheets that had locked away so much of the planet's water began to melt, and sea levels rose to match. Beringia, that vast country between two continents, began to drown. Slowly, over thousands of years, the land disappeared beneath the rising Bering Sea, until only the narrow strait and a scatter of islands, remnants like St. Lawrence Island, remained above water. The homeland where people had lived for millennia simply ceased to exist. It didn't collapse in a moment. It dissolved gradually, the way a coastline erodes, until there was nothing left to return to, even if anyone had wanted to. Which means the people who eventually spread across two entire continents came from a place that no longer has a location on any map. You cannot visit Beringia. There is no rock shelter to excavate, no ancient shoreline to walk along and imagine footprints in the sand. The place itself is gone, drowned under the strait that now separates the very continents it once joined. What remains is scattered across disciplines that had to be pieced together like fragments of a broken map. Ancient DNA pulled from a child's bones in Alaska, pollen grains, and beetle wings preserved in frozen sediment, stone tools left behind at sites from Siberia to Chile, and the deep, patient work of geneticists tracing mutations back through tens of thousands of years to reconstruct a population and a place we will never see directly. So here's the fuller picture. Long before anyone thought of themselves as the first Americans, there were people living in the middle of a continent that would eventually vanish beneath the sea. They weren't passing through. They were staying, adapting, teaching their children how to survive cold most of us can't fully picture, in a place richer with life than we once assumed. And when the time came to move again, some of them didn't walk between walls of ice. They followed the edge of the water, the way people had followed coastlines and crossed water for tens of thousands of years before them, all the way back to Africa. Beringia isn't a footnote on the road to somewhere else. It was somewhere. A homeland that existed for thousands of years and then quietly disappeared, leaving behind nothing but the people who came from it and the long, unbroken line of their descendants, stretching from the Arctic to the tip of South America.